So, Lawrence, I think the most obvious question, the most pressing question that a lot of us are wondering at the moment is why have these strikes taken place now? Why has this exploded right now?
It's a good question, and the answer lies in the calculations of Benjamin Netanyahu. There are a number of reasons why he would have liked to have done this for some time. The first condition, which came in place late last year, was that the sort of retaliation that would have been most dangerous and expected as a result of a strike like this would have come from uh, Hamas and Hezbollah, and both of them have been neutralized in effect. I mean, the war in Gaza, as we know, is hardly over and is still calamitous, but Hamas can't take the war to Israel. In Lebanon, the Lebanese government has made it very clear it doesn't want Hezbollah to start yet more attacks on Israel from Lebanese soil. So that was an important condition for the war to happen. Then Trump comes along, and Trump tells Netanyahu no attacks on Iran while there's a chance of a diplomatic breakthrough. So these talks get going quite quickly. They seem to be making progress. And then 23rd of May, I think it was, there was the last round, and it was followed by a proposal from the Americans that the Iranians rejected. What had happened is the Iranians were pushing for, and at one point I think believed they could get a deal that would allow them to continue enriching uranium to quite a significant degree, but making it clear through inspections and so on that they weren't moving to a weapon. The pressure that was put on Trump from Israel, but also from congressional hawks, meant that the actual proposal that went through, it was rejected by the Ayatollah Khamenei, the supreme leader. But talks hadn't finished. They were due to take place last Sunday. I think Netanyahu saw an opportunity to finish off the talks, which he was always suspicious of, always wary of. That depended on, if not a green light from Trump, at least not a red light. And they had a
Mm.
conversation on the 9th of June in which Trump sort of equivocated. But I think Netanyahu had concluded, partly based on Gaza, that when it came to the crunch, Trump wasn't going to stop him doing what he wanted to do.
Well, evidently there was a plan, and we should come back to that because the plan itself has been extraordinary, as you see. It clearly years in the making. I want to come back to the 7th of October as well, that you said was a kind of necessary condition, or what has happened since the 7th October is a necessary condition for the war that we're seeing right now. But just specifically before we get there, onto the kind of history of this, on Trump himself, that is a fascinating part of this equation, which I'm personally struggling to understand what his position is. In one sense, he seems to have used this very quickly to almost as like added leverage, added pressure on Iran, as if it's part of the negotiations themselves to sort of say, look, you need to make more concessions, otherwise I've got this guy over here who's going to come and attack you, and I can't control him. Like this, I didn't want this to happen, but he's only marginally on a leash here. Or is this something that is actually making Trump's job harder, and he didn't want to happen? It's quite hard to understand the truth there.
So I think Trump always sees himself as the great deal maker. He likes the idea of deals. I don't think he is a great deal maker, but that's how he sees himself. And I don't think he wants the US to be involved in the war. I mean, one shouldn't underestimate the importance of this as a campaign promise last
Mhm.
year. This is how he criticized Biden, constant wars under Biden. So I don't think he wants a war. I don't think he wants the US to be involved. He would like a deal. And what he said since the Israeli strikes is pretty consistent. One, the offer's still there. We can still talk. You should talk. You'd have been better off if you've talked before. Secondly, if you attack American targets, you'll really get the full weight of American force. I think in his mind, these two things go together. Now, I think that has quite an important deterrent effect on the Iranians
Mm.
because in the past, not only would one have expected Hezbollah to be unleashed, you would have expected attacks on a variety of regional targets, even, an attempt to close the Straits of Hormuz or something like that. And certainly attacks on American targets, which happened during Trump's first term. But the last thing the Iranians need at the moment is the Americans joining in. I mean, it's difficult enough coping with the Israelis, but it may well be that at least their nuclear sites survived to a degree this, which they wouldn't if the Americans were able to unleash their much bigger bombs on the enrichment plant. I think it contains the war in an interesting way, which wouldn't necessarily have happened in Trump's first term or even under Biden. And to some extent, you can argue this is a problem for Netanyahu because he can't quite finish the job if the Americans stay out. It does offer the Iranians a potential way out, which there are some indications they may want to take because, this is a pretty grim situation for them.
Right, and as you say, they seem to be responding in a way that keeps that option alive, the ability to maintain some kind of dialogue with the United States while hitting back directly at Israel. They haven't closed the Straits of Hormuz. They haven't
Yeah.
American targets. What do you make in that context of the story that came out over the weekend that President Trump vetoed an Israeli assassination proposal against the Ayatollah Khamenei?
It's interesting. It's interesting that American officials wanted this to be known because you could argue that's another signal to the Iranians
Mm.
that it could have been even worse. It would have been quite a step to take. He's a religious leader as well as a political leader. He's 86 nailing. He's not long for this world probably anyway. It would have been quite a stunning thing. And Israel's predilection for these sort of targeted killings, which is it's not unique to Israel, but it's a very sort of mixed strategic option because you're never quite sure what will come afterwards. It disrupts the organizations you hit. And Israel's taken out the leadership of Hamas and Hezbollah and has been having a go at the Houthis as well. So it's sort of in keeping with that, but it would have been it would have sort of made almost impossible any negotiations with Iran because Iran would have been in complete and utter turmoil.
Looking at the military situation right now, briefly, before we turn to the history, do you think that Netanyahu has taken a gamble based on an idea that he will be able to draw the Americans in to finish the job, I think, as you put it earlier, and that is the kind of central strategic gamble that he has taken here?
It's an interesting question, and I'm honestly not sure of the answer. I think he would be happier if the Americans were doing it. That's for sure, because he's urged them to do it in the past. Um, he's stated that this was always unilateral, that he told Trump, and Trump, in a sense, let him get on with it as a sort of national decision. So he must have known the possibility that Trump would not get engaged. You come back to the central problem that you have with all of these Israeli strikes, and Gaza was a mess from the start because they just weren't prepared to deal with Hamas in that way. But with Hezbollah, they were well prepared. With Iran, they were well prepared. It was cleverly executed strikes, but you never assure that they know what the next step is. Now, with Hezbollah, the political objective was quite modest. They just wanted it to get out of the war. That broke the solidarity of the so-called axis of resistance, and that was enough. And Hezbollah would only do that when they were pretty badly bloodied. So that ended that war. It's not clear what constitutes the end point for Israel. It can't keep this war going indefinitely because it just runs out of ordnance eventually. So Netanyahu seems to focus on the nuclear sites, but it increasingly has talked about regime change. Well, regime change may happen. It's a very fragile regime, but this is not something Israel can engineer. If it happens, it'll happen for Iranian reasons. So it's not clear what the end point is. I think it's more likely than most options at the moment, but these things are very, very difficult to predict, is that it may end with Iran offering some sort of diplomacy back to Trump. Trump then telling Israelis they've done enough, and Israel being left with sort of a job that's not quite complete.
In Israel, how would that be seen, though? Would that be seen as, well, at least, we took our opportunity and we degraded the Iranian um, nuclear capabilities for for a certain period of time. So whatever happens, there's some benefit to the Israelis. Is that how they would see it?
I think, look, I mean, you would hardly say this has been an operational failure from the Israeli point of view. They've certainly damaged and probably delayed the Iranian nuclear program. For decades now, Iran has been seen as the major villain in the Middle East, as far as they're concerned, orchestrating all of Israel's enemies against it, providing them with weapons. I mean, Hamas, Hezbollah wouldn't have been able to do what they did without Iranian support. And therefore, the sort of blows that have been struck at the heart of the Iranian military machine, as well as the nuclear capabilities, will take them a long time to recover from. Now, the Iranians have shown that they can send missiles of pretty deadly effect into Israel, but not to the extent that sort of brings Israel to its knees or anything like that. So I think it is the Israeli view will be that this was probably a necessary thing to try to do, that what they've achieved is quite a lot, but not as things stand, especially if somehow the regime survives and it has something of a nuclear program still to work on, not quite the definitive result they would have liked. Uh, so, the difficulty with any use of armed force like this is it rarely wholly solves your problems. That being said, I think at the moment the Israelis would feel that the damage done to the regime is so substantial that and it will take them such a while to recover, given also what's happened to Hamas and Hezbollah in Syria as well, for that matter. They've at least bought themselves quite a bit of time.
But have they paid a price for that, like in terms of diplomatic influence or in terms of diplomatic support? There was the statement from the British government that they wouldn't come to the immediate defense of Israel this time, unlike the last time. This is adding on to a growing sense of hostility, even revulsion over what is happening in Gaza. So, are they paying any price that would make the limited sort of military achievements that they have made sort of balance themselves out, or even in the end cause Netanyahu domestic problems because the Israelis think, you know what, we're left a bit exposed here.
Well, look, I mean, they've got themselves diplomatically isolated because of Gaza.
Hmm.
You've had uh, strong words from European, UK, Canadian, other governments about the carnage in Gaza and the situation of the Palestinians. You've had Israeli politicians sanctioned. The response to this has been more muted in comparison with Gaza because there is a problem with the Iranian nuclear program, and they do seem to have accelerated enrichment um, from late last year. And there was a report from the International Atomic Energy Agency that Iran had misled them about what it was up to and so on. So I think they sort of see the case much more, and there's no particular love for the Iranian regime, but they also are distancing themselves. They don't want to get involved. They don't want retaliation, um, and so for all those reasons, I don't think it makes a vast amount of difference to the Israeli diplomatic position. I think a bigger question for Netanyahu is the damage that has been done to Israelis, the people who've been killed, the fact that something of these missiles have got through. It's the sort of level of damage and casualty that can be absorbed, but it's pretty unpleasant as well. And there's going to be questions about um, air raid warnings and so on. But I think
Hmm.
against what they've done to the Iranians, I don't think there'll be massive complaints on the Israeli side.
Okay, well, let's take this, pull the camera back here now and try to think of this and how we have arrived at this situation. And in an excellent piece that you've written for the magazine this week, you talk about how there has been a sort of transformation in the power dynamics in the region since 7th of October. And it is remarkable when you think of what has happened since then. And it does almost feel as though that moment was like a sort of rock dropping into a pond, and we're seeing sort of wave after wave of consequences from that moment in ways that were very difficult to predict in the days after that attack. And you've seen the virtual destruction of Gaza as a place that is kind of survives in almost any sense. The destruction of Hezbollah, it seems, as a military power that at one point seemed to really hold a significant chokehold on Israel. That seems to have been taken out by those pager attacks and the bombing that the Israelis have conducted on Hezbollah positions in Lebanon. Then you've had the collapse of Syria and the emergence of a new regime there, and what seems like total Israeli military domination over the skies of Syria, which is another extraordinary moment in this story that has allowed this to happen. And what we are seeing in the news at the moment are Israeli claims of achieving air superiority over the Iranian skies. Now, each of these moments, in and of themselves, are extraordinarily important. Together, it seems utterly sort of seismic in ways that I'm not sure I understand what that means. You know, so I'd be interested to know how you see it in kind of longer sort of military terms. Are we seeing the emergence of a sort of almost a great power within the Middle East?
Well, Israel is still quite a small country, and this is
Mm.
forgotten. It's a militarized country, and it's been militarized almost from the moment of its independence. Um, so it's been militarily capable for a long time. Uh, Very strong air force, uh, amazing intelligence. I mean, the intelligence story with regard to both Lebanon and Iran is shows a lot of penetration into areas where you wouldn't expect them to know exactly what is going on and the whereabouts of key people and so on. And there isn't anybody else now in the region that can match them. I mean, all the other powers with which it has dealt with over its time, Egypt, Syria, Iraq, now Iran, are much diminished as military powers. So that gives Israel quite a lot of scope. In addition, of course, Russia had been very important in holding up Assad in power in Syria, and they're otherwise engaged in Ukraine and could do nothing for Assad at the end of last year. So yeah, Israel comes out of this able to operate almost anywhere it wants, presuming it has sufficient aircraft and ordnance and range. But it's quite impressive. The difficulty with Israel is always matching its political strategy with its military strategy. That let it down, I believe, badly with Gaza. I don't think there was ever going to be anything other than a pretty ferocious response to what had happened on the 7th of October. But there were always a way to build on that in a more positive way, in a form of governance in Gaza that provided for reconstruction, that excluded Hamas and so on. And those opportunities were offered and rejected, and you're left with the calamity we've got, which I think Israel will take a long time to live down. Myself, it's going to be there. The rest became opportunistic, I think. One thing led to another. Hezbollah didn't have to join in. Israel didn't attack Lebanon after the 7th of October. Hezbollah felt it had to do something. It had to show solidarity. So it mounted sufficient attacks to force evacuations from the border, to draw the Israelis in, to open up a second front, but it didn't throw the full weight of its capabilities against Israel when Israel actually was at its most vulnerable, which meant that when Israel had dealt effectively with Hamas, and could release some of the IDF, they could turn on Hezbollah, which they did with the pager attacks, targeted killings of Hezbollah leadership. Uh, they took apart its militias, its capabilities. With both Gaza and Lebanon, there were these tunnels that got them to the border areas, which were dismantled. All of that was taking place. And then Syria was unexpected. I mean, that just came because all of a sudden the Turks, in fact, realized that Assad had nothing to hold him up. And
Mm.
out he went. So it's been one thing after another. I don't think this was planned by the Israelis at all in that way. I mean, their assumption was that Gaza was stable, that Hamas had been pacified in a sense, and they had no interest in Gaza, and they trusted that Hamas had little interest in them, which turned out to be a big miscalculation. So Israel hadn't planned all of this, but it unfolded step by step until eventually you end up with Iran, who's the sort of the big power behind all of this.
I guess the question, Lawrence, for me, in that telling of the story of the last couple of years, is whether there will be Israeli overreach into this sort of void that they have, they found they've pushed in each direction, and they've found that they've sort of knocked over each of their enemies one after the next, and then Syria has fallen without them even touching it. They've moved in, they've set up military bases there, and they've achieved military dominance. But as you said, Israel is ultimately a small country. It doesn't have unlimited resources. It is dependent on the support of others for its military capabilities. It requires the United States to, finish the job, as you put it. And what we're seeing, in one sense, is the great powers of the world not being strong enough to impose order in this region. The United States not wanting to get involved anymore. Russia not being able to because of Ukraine. China choosing not to, or not being able to yet, prioritizing other areas, other things. And so you're left with a vacuum. But into that vacuum, surely somebody will start to assert their own power. And you mentioned Turkey before, but I've been thinking during this conversation of Saudi Arabia. There are other military powers in the Middle East who will surely not allow Israel, a small country, to maintain total dominance. There is something dangerous and unpredictable about where we're heading.
There is, most of the Gulf states have made their peace with Israel. They say they don't like what Israel's doing to Iran, but I think in private, some of them don't mind at all. Israel doesn't have a border with Iran. It's not going to occupy Iran. Uh, it, in a sense, if there is a collapse of power within Iran, and that could lead to all sorts of unruly and dangerous forces fighting for control. Israel is a spectator in some ways. It's carved out a bit of territory in Syria, but it's not going to try and run Syria. It's not going to try and run Lebanon. The only territory it cares about is Palestinian territory. It doesn't really care about Gaza. I mean, they're talking now about more occupation, but the general view in Israel, even on the right, is the territory they care about is the West Bank and Jerusalem, East Jerusalem. And I think while Gaza's been going on, people haven't paid enough attention to the push there to establish more settlements and so on.
Hmm.
And that's the point of tension with the Saudis and so on. From the Saudi point of view, they've got an American administration that is prepared to do all sorts of deals with them without nagging them about human rights. Um, they are also a very strong power in the region. They're not, I mean, when they tried to assert themselves militarily in Yemen, they got into a bit of a mess. Um, and so I don't think they're that keen to do that anymore, and they're still bothered about the situation in Yemen. Um, the UAE is not always in lockstep with the Saudis. They have interest in Africa and so on. So these are, I mean, the UAE is turning into quite a significant international player as well. It's just not
Mm,
particularly on the military side.
mm,
Even in artificial intelligence, and quite economically dynamic now. So these are the areas where they're making their play. I think the big question is what happens to Iran. And even before all of this, Iran was in a fragile state. Its economy is in a mess. The population is hostile to the regime. There's more and more acts of defiance, and that is why the idea of regime change of some sort of insurrection, it's not wholly fanciful. It's just not something Israel can do or control. So I think there are limits to what, actually, I think limits to what Israel has an interest in doing. Its interests are Palestine. And even
mm.
on Palestine, Israel is divided still. I mean, there are still many politicians who are very nervous about current policies, which alienate yet another generation of Palestinians, offer very little hope, and seem to rely on wholly fanciful notions of mass deportations, mass exodus to places where nobody's going to accept them. So I think that's the issue, and it's a divisive issue still in Israeli politics. What happens with Iran in the future only matters in the end, so long as it's linked with that issue. You have to remember that up to 1979, Israel's second biggest embassy was in Tehran. Israel
Mm.
was very close to Iran under the Shah, too close in some ways, because it was the connections of Mossad with Savak, the Israeli secret police. That was one of the things that many Iranians objected to. But it was close and had similar strategic interests. Some Israelis will think maybe one day we'll go back to that. Some Iranians may think that too. So, but that all depends on developments that hard to grasp, that Israel certainly can't control, that take place within Iran. And I think when the dust settles from all of this, uh, that the internal politics of Iran is going to be crucial. But again, as with all these things, very unpredictable.
I mean, it really is extraordinary listening to you there, Lawrence, because in one sense you set out very clearly how the Israelis are acting opportunistically, sort of one after the other here, until we reach the point that we've reached. And militarily, that has come with quite a bit of success. Uh, in humanitarian terms, often appalling costs. But in terms of the politics, it doesn't seem to have answered any of the sort of the deeper questions that we're talking about. And that point that you raised, that beyond the horror of what we're seeing in Gaza, we perhaps are in danger of missing something incredibly consequential that is going on in the West Bank. And that is something that, again, it's not clear that the Israelis have a kind of political strategy here, other than sort of furthering control, furthering Israeli settlements. And it does make you wonder that if the end result here is greater Israeli military strength, fewer sort of countervailing forces in the region, that the prospects of a two-state solution of the sort that we've thought about for a long time appear to be diminishing.
Yes, I mean, they're pretty dead at the moment. There is a clear political strategy within Israel, but it's on the right. Um, and Netanyahu depends on pretty extreme grouping to maintain his coalition. And though at times they sort of look like they might bring him down, the fact is they'd go down with him. So
Mm.
we don't have another election in Israel till next year. But Netanyahu is still fighting for his political life in Israel, still pretty unpopular, still widely blamed for allowing the 7th of October to happen. So Israeli politics is all over the place in many ways. Just Netanyahu has dominated them for so long, and he is an extremely clever operator. So he somehow manages to stay in power. And, for as long, really since the 1990s, he's made no pretense to have any interest in a Palestinian state.
Mm.
And part of his strategy, which is why many in Israel blame him for being far too, in some way, supportive of Hamas up to 23, was to keep the Palestinians divided, with the
Mm.
Palestinian Authority in Ramallah and Hamas in Gaza. It suited him that they were divided. And when attempts were made to get them to come together, that they fell apart through their own rivalries and so on. So it's not only Israel that has got us to this situation. Um, the difficulty you get is that there's no, unless you give Palestinians a way, one way or the other, of expressing their political rights, of getting some control over their own lives and their own economy. This is a problem without end. It's never going to go away. And Israel manages to cope, but at some point it won't cope. And who knows when? And therefore that's why it remains a divisive issue in Israeli politics. The problem is that, after first the Second Intifada at the start of this century, after what seemed to many Israelis to be a pretty good offer made to the Palestinians to do a deal under Clinton, and then after 7th of October, the sort of peace camp in Israel is incredibly weak
Mm.
because the answer comes back. This is what happens. You give them an opportunity, and this is how they take it. So there are reasons within Israel why the right is as strong as it is, and we'll look back, and we'll certainly be highly critical of what Israel has done since the 7th of October. But in the end, it's hard to think of a more catastrophic strategic blunder than Hamas's attack on Israel on the 7th of October 23.